Today I've invited Connor Moen and Andrea Chalupa to give us a little bit of insight into the Holodomor and some of the background that came from a number of instances that we've been following over the decades from Ukraine. Andrea and Connor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for
having us. Yeah.
Great. Connor, tell us a little bit about the organization that you're with and how we came to have Andrea here.
Absolutely. So I am the president of our local Ukrainian student organization at the U of S. We are the Ukrainian Student Association, and we have a few mandates. We want to raise awareness basically for the Ukrainian community in Saskatoon, and this is done politically, culturally, historically, and so one of our biggest events is really raising awareness about the Holodomor, which we will get into later. And so every single year for this Holodomor Awareness Week, we do a series of events to kind of get the university community, the Ukrainian community, the Saskatoon community, just to engage them all, tell them a little bit more about this. And this year is just a little bit more special because this year we invited this lady here, Andrea, to come in all the way from New York to talk about the Holodomor.
I think that's marvelous that you took this opportunity to come here. Andrea, give us a bit of background about yourself. It's a remarkable bio that you have, but tell us a little bit more about you.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I was very much looking forward to visiting Saskatoon, especially I couldn't say no to Connor's invitation. Some of the things in my bio I actually owe to Canadian university students like Connor. So as a journalist in New York City, I wrote a book called Orwell and the Refugees. And when that book came out, I got an invitation from a SUSK, Ukrainian student, I don't know the acronym, but
Ukrainian Student Association.
Yes, thank you very much. So they sent me on a 2-week speaking tour to universities from like University of Calgary, McGill, University of Toronto, and from that 2-week experience, I met a lot of Ukrainian Canadian student leaders across Canada, and I was so inspired by all the work they were doing. And when I got home to New York and caught up on my sleep, I looked on the TV, and there was my people in Ukraine, the land of my heritage, where both my parents came from, rising up against their corrupt government. And it was very difficult to watch as the peaceful revolution turned into something that was a police crackdown by just really awful, being up till 3 a.m. on the live stream watching peaceful protesters being beaten by riot police, and I just had to do something. And so I launched a Twitter storm, and the first group that I invited to come help me, come join me, were Canadian students. And that's through our joint efforts, we're able to make Ukraine go globally trending on Twitter for the very first time within minutes. And we got shout outs from the Prime Minister of France, Russell Brand, Bianca Jagger, Gary Kasparov, Bill Clinton, Richard Branson. And we were able to give Ukrainian protesters a voice in English to really speak to the West, like, we need your help. We're being killed fighting for democracy. So my bio is really owed to Canadians here, so I'm very grateful to be back here.
I think it was interesting that our former Prime Minister, had told Putin at that time to get out of Ukraine at their meeting. What type of background, when we hear about the invasion of the Russian government into Crimea, and when we're told that there's primarily Russian speaking in the east of Ukraine, there's a reason for that. How would you explain that?
Well, part of the reason, it's so important for us to have these events like Holodomor Awareness Week is because Putin's invasion of Ukraine today, the foundation of it was laid by Stalin in 1932, 1933, when he deliberately starved to death millions of Ukrainians in his genocide famine. And when those millions were killed, he then bussed in Russians to replace them. So the so-called Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine today have only been there for a few generations, so that they don't feel connected to the rest of the country in a way that Western Ukrainians do. And so it was very, obviously without the second most powerful military in the world, which is Russia, of course, without their backing, these Russian speakers couldn't have risen up. They needed like that huge influx of Russian soldiers coming in, Russian tanks, Russian heavy machinery. And so Putin is very much carrying on the work of Stalin. And you see that with billboards glorifying Stalin going up in Donetsk, Ukraine, a city currently under Russian occupation. You see that with statues of Stalin going up in Russia. And you see that with a museum glorifying Stalin in Russia. And you see a lot of memorials dedicated to the victims of Soviet repression being shut down and being dubbed foreign agents. So it's the Soviet playbook. It works. Why change something if it works? They're very successful under Stalin, and Putin is very much using that same bag of tricks. And I really want to just stress on this topic of the famine that Stalin was able to get away with starving to death millions of Ukrainians because the Kremlin waged a very effective propaganda war. The entire time Ukrainians were suffering this slow, agonizing death, the Kremlin, through the media, fooled the rest of the world, fooled Western leaders into thinking that the Soviet Union at the time was the workers' paradise. And today, Putin is doing the same thing by fooling the rest of the world and thinking that there is a so-called neo-Nazi far-right problem in Ukraine. And the motivation for doing that is so that he convinces Western citizens and their leaders to not care about Ukraine, not give Ukraine the support it so desperately needs right now as it's fighting for democracy. So so much as Ukrainian lives once again are at stake, and they're being victimized once again by an extremely effective Kremlin propaganda war. It's almost $2 billion internationally that the Kremlin is spending on spreading lies.
When we talked about the famine of 32, 33, and a lot of that, I think our own Canadian government has acknowledged that genocide of that decade. Just some quick math on our own part. The 2011 census in Canada shows about 10.1 million people from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, which is essentially the death of Western Canada, trying to use an analogy. That type of engineering if you read back, I guess the question is, how do you know what is the truth and what's being fabricated as the truth? How do you filter that?
It's extremely difficult, and that's why the Kremlin is getting away with it once again. In New York, no matter where I give a talk in the West, intelligent people ask me incredibly stupid questions. They'll ask questions like, how are the Russian speakers in Ukraine? Are they safe? What about the neo-Nazis in Ukraine? Just on Monday, just the other weekend in Washington, D.C., Ukraine's chief rabbi joined with other religious leaders from Ukraine to meet with President Obama's White House with his representatives to pressure the White House to give greater support to Ukraine. And why would the chief rabbi do that if there was a neo-Nazi fascist problem in Ukraine? There just simply isn't. So what we need to do to make ourselves aware and cut through the veil of Putin's propaganda is just study history, read widely, read Pulitzer Prize winners like Anne Applebaum. She's a brilliant historian. Read Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands. You have to check your sources, and you have to read very, very carefully. I can't tell you how unprecedented this information war is that we're in today. It's not only coming from Putin, it's also coming from ISIS. I was taking a cab home really late at night in New York, and my Sudanese Islamic cab driver was trying to convince me that the CIA started ISIS. And as proof, he shows me a video, and in the video is footage of a friend of mine who's a Syrian human rights activist, and the footage of him is taken completely out of context. And he's like, see, and I know this individual very well in the video. He does amazing work. Syria needs him desperately. The Syrians on the ground who are suffering under ISIS occupation need him. And here in this horrible video, he's being completely taken out of context. So we all just have to read widely, read carefully.
I guess when we look at that message, Connor, that the university students picked up on, you're the founder of the Digital Maidan, right?
I launched that social media movement.
And maybe before that question, how did that start with you?
That started with me out of desperation. I was up until 3, 4 in the morning on the live stream watching protesters being beaten. And I was a social media wallflower before, and I had no choice but to launch a Facebook event page. I invited 99 friends who I knew were deeply interested in Ukraine, including predominantly a lot of Canadian students. And within 2 days, we had 30,000 people invited. Wow. And we flooded Twitter within minutes. And it was what it did was it brought Ukrainians together globally so we could organize grassroots to raise desperately needed funding for medical supplies for the protesters, fact check propaganda, put on fundraisers and other events pressuring Western leaders to really pay attention to what was going on in Ukraine. The West was caught off guard by Putin's invasion of Crimea in the East. They were not ready for it. They were really counting on the magic of the reset button. But Putin is KGB. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. You just simply can't.
A lot of that might be fear, I suppose, too, in oppressed people. Go back to 1544 when the Turks invaded Ukraine. I mean, as a breadbasket of Europe, that type of wanting to occupy that space. Connor, when you saw this opportunity come through on that social media, what did you do?
Well, for us, we jumped on board immediately because this was just such an important cause. It was a really exciting time too because a lot of us were pretty young when the Orange Revolution was happening, and unfortunately not a lot of things actually came from that. So here we were kind of seeing like a new chance for Ukraine to revitalize itself, and so all we had to do was just go on social media, follow the instructions, and just spread the message.
And I'm going to raise the question again because if I'm looking online and you're talking about the credibility of the source, is it someone who's on the front end? How do I know that that person isn't part of the opposing team, if you will, and spreading that message? How do I filter that as a citizen? How would I know? Maybe I'll ask
Well, you want to always look. I noticed that some of the people that were writing, oh, Ukraine is fascist, for instance, they either had a book to sell on the topic or they had some other sort of way that they're benefiting from that argument. They had some axe to grind with some of the people involved. But the best indicator is academia, in the sense that when you're in academia, you have to publish or perish. And there's no time for you to let your political agenda come in. So academics they have to be as pure as possible in what they write. So look at the academics, read the books they're producing on this part of the world, on Ukraine and Russia relations, Soviet history. And that's a good way to sort of educate yourself. You can't understand the current headlines without knowing the history of Ukraine and Russia.
Most impressive. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.